Thank you for your work so far in the class, and I look forward to reading what you have to say about René Descartes. I've pulled together some of the resources from my shelves, and as you see behind me I have quite a number of books from which to pull. I literally have 1,000 different books on philosophy sitting on the shelves in my rooms, so I am sometimes at a loss to know exactly which one to refer to, so I thought I'd refer to several of them. This book by Stumpf and Pfizer is a book that's used at Harvard University for their introduction to philosophy. And one of the things it has to say at the beginning of its talk on Descartes is that he is usually called the father of modern philosophy, and not without good reason. He was born in 1596. For a time he was a soldier. After a while he was traveling throughout Europe and settled in Holland. He then wrote Discourse on Method, Meditations on First Philosophy, both of which you have segments to read for this week, by the way, Principles of Philosophy, and Passions of the Soul. He was actually sought after by many leading lights in Europe, including monarchs, to come and teach them philosophy. The way he died was that he was summoned to be the tutor for the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christiana, who seemed to want to do her philosophy at 5 a.m. in the morning. And Descartes, having been born in southern Europe, being transplanted to northern Europe, didn't quite take to the cold very well. It sort of reminds me of Apis in a way, of doing philosophy at all hours of the day or night whenever it sort of fits you. But that's what Stumpf and Pfizer have to say. The Oxford Companion to Philosophy, which is a book that I use quite frequently, this is an encyclopedic compilation of issues from philosophy, and it has several pages on René Descartes. You can sort of compare him to a modern day person, Jacques Derrida, who comes right before, who has barely 3 paragraphs. It says, beyond question, Descartes was the chief architect of the 17th century intellectual revolution, which destabilized the traditional doctrines of medieval and Renaissance scholasticism and laid down the philosophical foundations for what we call the modern scientific age. I apologize if I sound a bit funny because I have a cold today, and I've had a cold most of the week, and I tried to let it go by before I made this video, but here we are. We're at the end of the week and I need to make the video, so you're getting my stuffiness. I do apologize. This is another book that I use quite frequently. It is the shorter Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The longer, or just the regular Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is, I believe, 12 volumes, so the shorter is easier to hold in my hands. And it again has Derrida, by comparison, 2 paragraphs, and René Descartes has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages of material. So, of course, René Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy, attempted to break with philosophical traditions of his day and start philosophy anew, rejecting the Aristotelian philosophy of the schools, and that relates back to what the Oxford book was talking about, scholasticism, the authority of tradition and the authority of the senses. He built a philosophical system that included a method of inquiry, a metaphysics, a mechanic, physics and biology, and an account of human psychology intended to ground an ethics. He was important as the founder of new analytic geometry, which combines geometry and algebra, and whose certainty provided a kind of model for the rest of his philosophy. So it's interesting that Descartes had this idea of certainty in mathematics, since there were so few things about which he was certain. But if we look at any kind of geometric system, you always start out with a few things that you put out there that don't have to be proved, that don't have to be defined. You always have to have your first principles. You have to have some set of axioms, some set of postulates that will let you build upon it. And Euclid had his system, other people have had other systems, and you try to narrow down the number of things you take for granted, the number of things you assume or you just have to allow as being without being proved, to the fewest number possible, and then build from there. That's really, in many ways, what Descartes did with his own philosophy. He took everything off the table and decided what can we really say about what it is we're doing, what it is that we know, what it is we feel, and how can we be sure of any of this. And about the only thing he eventually decided was that he was the one who was experiencing things. Now, one of the problems with this is that you can only prove experience by experience. You can't prove it by someone else's experience. You can't do experience secondhand. Think about the puzzle of trying to describe the color red or the color blue to someone who was blind from birth. How will they know? What kinds of terms would you use? And how could you ever know, as a sighted person who knows what red and blue is, that they are ever getting the true image of what red and blue is? On the other hand, what they experience as red or blue will be radically different as well, for not having had the sort of biased, light-based information that we get. But do we get it? Indeed, Descartes believed, I think, many ways, that all of reality might just be one big Star Trek holodeck. He called it the deceiving demon, since he didn't have cable and he didn't get Star Trek back then. But in many ways, he was tapping into the same idea. How do we know that all the things around us are not just illusions, are not just being produced by someone or something somewhere in order to fool us? Because ultimately, outside of our own brains, it becomes very difficult to prove different things. Well, in talking about these, he worked on Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. One of the earliest books on philosophy I ever read was this one right here, Descartes, those two works. And in your book, The European Philosophers, you have excerpts both of the Discourse on Method as well as the Meditations. If I had to assign one book that every college student should read before graduating, Discourse on Method would probably be it, because it doesn't really tell you what to think as much as it tells you how to think and how to analyze things and how to critically take apart different things. And I remember that this was one of the earliest books that we read in one of my earliest honors classes years and years and years ago, and I won't even tell you how many. You can ask the deceiving demon how many years ago that was. But he really looks at educational processes and how we build our own foundation, and he argues in many ways that education needs to be a personal responsibility. And that's something that I think those students that we have in our college really can take to heart, because being at a distance, you are really responsible for your own education in many ways. Again, I apologize for the cold that I have. In conclusion, I want to recommend one book. I'm a fan of the very short introduction series put out by the Oxford Press, and they have one on Descartes by Tom Sorrell. And in this, they talk about his life, his discovery of what he wanted to do in life, because he was someone who, again, I relate to very well, sort of goes from job to job to job, from profession to profession before deciding this is what I'm really called to do. And then once he does that, he jumps in with no reservations. He immerses himself into the idea that philosophy has done some good service in the past but needs to be reformed. He might have avoided the word reformed given the other issues with the Reformation that were going on, but in many ways he revolutionized things. He came along roughly at the same period of time in the world when Copernicus and Galileo were making their observations, when the Reformation was challenging the institutional church, and Descartes put a sort of seal on things intellectually by saying it's really okay to be pursuing different avenues of thought that don't necessarily find themselves based on superstition or mysticism or faith, but really ground themselves into something that is more permanent. And much of our modern thinking, while it doesn't always do away with the other ideas, really builds society on that rationalism. And thus, later, Immanuel Kant will proclaim him the first of the rationalists. So I look forward to seeing what you have to say about Descartes, and I thank you for your attention.